In April 2025, President Donald Trump announced a rollback of his once-praised tariffs on Chinese goods. The move was meant to stabilize markets. Instead, it triggered mockery. The phrase, "Trump chickened out," exploded across Chinese social media, trending with over 150 million views. For many in China, it wasn't a diplomatic compromise, it was a retreat. But what really drove this reversal? Economic strain? Political pressure? Or something more strategic? Tonight, we unpack the trade shift that sparked a digital firestorm, and ask, is this the end of Trump's tariff war, or just a new beginning? In 2018, a new era of American economic nationalism began, one that would redefine global trade and reshape the world's two largest economies. President Donald Trump, fulfilling a campaign promise to confront what he called China's unfair trade practices, launched a sweeping tariff assault on Chinese goods. The first round of tariffs targeted $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. Electronics, machinery, automotive parts. The message was clear: confront or concede. Beijing retaliated swiftly, targeting American agriculture, the very heartland that had helped elect Trump. China, once the top buyer of U.S. soybeans, cut purchases almost entirely. Exports collapsed. The American farming industry, already facing price volatility and debt, was thrown into crisis. By 2019, farm bankruptcies hit an 8-year high. Washington responded, not with a deal, but with bailout checks. Over $28 billion was allocated in emergency relief, mostly to appease farmers bearing the brunt of Trump's economic war. But the damage wasn't limited to agriculture. Retailers, auto manufacturers, and tech companies all sounded the alarm. American companies that relied on global supply chains saw costs rise dramatically. Consumers felt it, too, on store shelves, at the gas pump, and in monthly bills. Inflation, once dormant, began to climb. Despite mounting domestic pressure, Trump stood firm. Or so it seemed. In January 2020, the Phase 1 deal was signed. China pledged to purchase an additional $200 billion in U.S. goods. But the details were vague. Enforcement mechanisms were weak. And then, the pandemic hit. As COVID-19 brought the global economy to a halt, trade slowed dramatically. But so did the political rhetoric, temporarily. By 2022, inflation had surged, and the Federal Reserve began its most aggressive interest rate hikes in decades. For many economists, the real problem wasn't just COVID. It was unresolved supply chain stress, and tariffs that refused to go away. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Retail giants warned of shortages. Tech companies faced semiconductor delays. And as the 2024 campaign season began, Trump, now a candidate once again, faced a new political landscape. His base, once energized by tough talk on China, was feeling the pain. Prices were too high. Exports too low. Support among independent voters was slipping. And business leaders, even conservative ones, began asking a simple question: when would the tariffs end? In April 2025, after years of defiance, the announcement came. The administration would ease tariffs on Chinese goods, particularly those driving up consumer costs. The move was billed as pragmatic. But in China, it was seen very differently. When the White House announced it would ease tariffs on Chinese imports in April 2025, global markets responded with cautious optimism. But inside China's digital space, the reaction was anything but diplomatic. On Weibo, one of China's largest social media platforms, the phrase, "Trump chickened out," shot to the top of national trends. It wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a cultural moment. A release of years of frustration, mockery, and strategic satisfaction, poured out in memes, videos, satire, and millions of reposts. These weren't fringe jokes. They were polished, viral, and often AI-enhanced. Some clips depicted Trump being outplayed by President Xi at a poker table. Others showed Americans in MAGA hats stitching labels in Chinese factories, a dig at the irony of "Made in America" products still reliant on overseas supply chains. For many Chinese netizens, this was not just humor, it was vindication. For nearly 7 years, China had endured a US-led tariff assault, one that attempted to decouple the world's two largest economies. Now, as Trump stepped back, even slightly, the perception was clear: China had stood firm. America had blinked. The phrase, loosely translated as "chickened out," carries particular weight in Chinese internet culture. It implies not just withdrawal, but weakness after bravado. Its virality reflected a powerful shift in public narrative: the aggressor was now in retreat, and the battlefield had moved from tariffs to memes. Even Chinese state media, usually restrained in tone, allowed the sentiment to linger. While official statements were cautious, op-eds in state-run outlets like Global Times hinted at quiet satisfaction. Headlines read, "U.S. trade aggression ends not with a bang, but with a retreat." State voices struck a balance, celebrating the rollback as a rational move, while letting the online sphere do the emotional work. It was a coordinated soft power display, dignity on the surface, dominance below. But this moment also reveals something deeper: how social media, in the hands of a digitally native public, can become an instrument of foreign policy messaging. While Washington released a press statement, Beijing's netizens launched a campaign of satire, instantly, globally, virally. Some American analysts called it digital humiliation. Others saw it as the inevitable result of years of swagger turned soft. But to Chinese citizens, especially Gen Z, this wasn't just funny. It was symbolic. A moment where China not only survived a trade war, it won the last word. In the end, the rollback may have stabilized economic tensions. But in the online arena, it signaled something far more powerful: the rise of digital narrative warfare, where hashtags are weapons, and satire is strategy. After 7 years of economic confrontation, the question now facing historians and voters alike is simple: did Donald Trump step back from his tariff war with China because he wanted to, or because he had no choice? For many supporters, the original trade war was the cornerstone of the America First doctrine. It wasn't just about economics, it was identity politics in motion. Trump vowed to bring jobs back, punish intellectual property theft, and restore American manufacturing might. But nearly a decade later, the economic and political landscape looks very different. America is now grappling with its highest consumer inflation in 40 years. Supply chains remain tangled. And the one solid farming bloc that helped deliver Trump the presidency is showing signs of revolt. Since the trade war began, the U.S. agriculture sector has lost an estimated $28 billion in export revenue. Many farmers depended on bailout programs just to survive. The irony? The same communities that cheered the tariffs in 2018 were now the ones being suffocated by them in 2025. And it wasn't just rural America. Wall Street had begun to turn as well. Corporate giants like Apple, Boeing, and Walmart, each deeply embedded in global supply chains, urged the administration to shift course. Internal lobbying intensified. CEOs made private visits to Washington. And quietly, the mood changed. By late 2024, as election season accelerated, the strategic calculus grew sharper. Trump was no longer just a former president seeking redemption. He was a frontrunner facing a divided electorate, with economic anxiety topping the list of voter concerns. The math was brutal: if the tariffs hurt consumers, farmers, and businesses, where was the win? Even key Republican donors began shifting their support to more trade-friendly contenders, seeing Trump's stance as outdated and economically hazardous. Faced with this multi-front pressure, from business, voters, and even within his own party, Trump recalibrated. His April 2025 rollback announcement, delivered without fanfare, marked a quiet but undeniable retreat. Supporters claim it was pragmatic leadership. That Trump, the dealmaker, was setting the stage for a new negotiation round. But critics, and international observers, saw something else: a man who had pushed the trade war to its limit, and had run out of road. Strategic retreat or political necessity? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Trump understood that global economic power isn't restored through tariffs alone, but through influence, alliances, and, increasingly, perception. And perception, in 2025, is no longer just shaped by headlines. It's shaped by social media, memes, market data, and mood. While Trump's policies may have changed on paper, what mattered more was how the world, and his rivals, interpreted it. When a global superpower changes course, the world doesn't just watch, it recalibrates. The United States stepping back from its high-stakes tariff war with China wasn't just an American political pivot. It was a signal. And the signal echoed. In Brussels, the European Union issued a carefully worded response, calling the move a welcome de-escalation, while quietly reviewing its own trade strategy with Beijing. In Tokyo and Seoul, leaders expressed relief, yet reaffirmed their push for diversified supply chains, less dependent on either superpower. To allies, Trump's decision was a double-edged message. On one side, a return to pragmatism. On the other, unreliability. The U.S., once leading the charge against China's trade practices, was now dialing it back, alone, and with no coordinated multilateral strategy. In Southeast Asia, governments moved swiftly. Vietnam, already one of the biggest beneficiaries of the trade war's supply chain shift, saw a spike in foreign direct investment. Warehouses in Da Nang, Ho Chi Minh City, and Binh Duong reported record orders. Tech companies from the US, Japan, and Europe, once dependent on China, now signed long-term contracts with Vietnamese factories. In India, the narrative was one of opportunity. New Delhi, which has positioned itself as a geopolitical and manufacturing counterweight to Beijing, announced an updated Make in India 2.0 plan within 72 hours of the US rollback. The goal: capture what China may lose, at scale. Mexico, too, accelerated its reindustrialization ambitions under the USMCA framework. American companies weary of geopolitical volatility looked south. Nearshoring became the new buzzword. Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Mexico City are now home to the fastest-growing electronics clusters in the Western Hemisphere. But while supply chains scrambled to adapt, rival powers read between the lines. In Moscow, the Kremlin media didn't miss a beat. State-owned channels portrayed Trump's retreat as symbolic of American inconsistency and vulnerability. The trade war, they said, had proven that the U.S. could no longer absorb the costs of its own confrontations. In Beijing, the official reaction was restrained. President Xi Jinping made no public comment. Instead, state media focused on China's resilience. Behind closed doors, however, policy advisors reportedly celebrated a quiet victory, not of economy, but of narrative. The perception that the U.S. blinked first had already gone global. In capitals across the global south, the implications were equally clear. Nations from Brazil to Nigeria to Indonesia saw the moment not just as an economic adjustment, but as proof that the global order is shifting. If the U.S. retreats under domestic pressure, how dependable is it as an economic partner? And in multilateral forums, from the WTO to Davos, talk shifted rapidly. Was the age of unilateral economic power waning? Would the future of trade be multipolar, mediated not through might, but through balance? What the world saw was not just tariff reduction, but strategic retreat. And in the 21st century, where influence is the currency of power, retreat leaves a vacuum. And vacuums never last long. Some countries rush to fill that space with commerce. Others, with storylines. The notion that America backed down echoed far louder than the actual policy itself. And in today's fractured world, perception, more than policy, defines momentum. As the U.S. reset its trade approach, the rest of the world recalculated its position, not just around China, but around a quieter, less certain America. One decision changed tariffs. But it also shifted the balance of narrative power. In the wake of America's trade reversal, a larger transformation has quietly accelerated, a rewiring of the global economy. The old trade map, once defined by dominant routes between the U.S. and China, is giving way to a more complex, decentralized network. And in this new world, the winners are not the loudest, but the fastest. For decades, globalization followed a simple equation: manufacture in China, consume in the West. But the trade war, and now Trump's retreat, has proven that the world is not only more fragile than we thought, it's also more adaptive. Countries that once played peripheral roles are now emerging as central nodes in a newly forming web of trade. In the heart of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia have positioned themselves as the world's China plus one, ready to absorb supply chain overflow, armed with tax incentives, young labor forces, and logistical modernization. Further west, India has launched its most aggressive industrialization wave since independence. The production-linked incentive scheme has drawn global giants, from Apple to Samsung, to manufacture not just for India, but from India to the world. In Africa, investment flows from China, the EU, and the Gulf have helped countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria become rising stars in agro-processing, digital services, and logistics. Africa's intercontinental trade, once fragmented, is now surging, fueled by the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. Latin America is riding a parallel wave. Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil are capturing the nearshoring trend, where U.S. companies bring production closer to home. Guadalajara is now dubbed the Silicon Valley of the South, with microchip foundries and AI startups blooming under the radar. But it's not just about geography. The way the world trades is also being rewritten, digitally. The fourth industrial revolution has brought AI-managed supply chains, blockchain-verifiable sourcing, and real-time risk analytics into the boardrooms of even small businesses. In this new economy, flexibility is power. And while the U.S. China tariff war caused disruption, it also unleashed innovation. Companies are no longer asking where labor is cheapest. They're asking, where is risk lowest? Where is delivery fastest? Where is the future heading? The reshaping isn't just economic, it's strategic. The world's trading blocs have reawakened. The EU has inked new digital and green trade deals with ASEAN. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, is now the largest trade pact in history, covering 30% of global GDP, without the United States. And BRICS Plus, led by China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa, is quietly negotiating its own digital currency standard. In Washington, policymakers speak of friendshoring, trading only with allies. But the rest of the world is speaking a different language: redundancy, agility, regionalism. In this post-hegemonic age, nations are no longer waiting for superpowers to set the rules. They're writing their own playbooks. And at the grassroots level, change is palpable. In Nairobi, a woman-led logistics startup is exporting Kenyan textiles to Seoul. In Medellin, a cacao cooperative now sells directly to Berlin, skipping traditional middlemen entirely. In Bangkok, a 24-year-old developer is building the next Stripe, custom-fit for Southeast Asia's informal economy. The global economy is no longer a linear flow from east to west. It's a living, pulsing network, one that grows every time a contract is signed in Mumbai, a cargo ship docks in Lagos. Trump's tariff war fractured a system. His retreat signaled its end. But what's rising now is not a return to the old order, it's the birth of something fundamentally new. A world that is more distributed, more regional, and more digital than ever before. This isn't deglobalization. It's reglobalization, on new terms, with new leaders, and a new balance of power that no one nation controls. The trade war is not over. The tariffs may have eased. The headlines may have moved on. But what lingers, is the story. Across continents and cultures, politics is no longer just a matter of policy. It is a contest of narratives. A battle for meaning. A race to define who stands tall, and who folds. Donald Trump didn't just roll back tariffs. He rewrote a chapter of American diplomacy. And for a generation raised on screens, hashtags, and streaming news, the symbol of that retreat now speaks louder than its rationale. In 2025, the global economy is increasingly shaped not by treaties alone, but by the perceptions surrounding them. The word chickened out may seem trivial, but in a world of digital immediacy, perception is position. China understood this. While its diplomats remained measured, its online communities roared. The meme became the message. And the message, the US doesn't have the stomach for a long game. Soft power has long been discussed in think tanks and white papers. But now, it lives in motion, across feeds, reels, forums, and videos under 60 seconds. We are no longer in the age of industrial power alone. We are in the age of symbolic power. The US built its post-war leadership not just on bombs and dollars, but on belief. The American dream. The Hollywood story. The Apple aesthetic. The English language. The free press. For decades, America didn't just export products, it exported aspiration. But narratives, like empires, shift. Today, cultural power is decentralized. A K-pop song charts in Argentina. A Kenyan crypto app becomes a model in Jakarta. A Chinese historical drama wins over fans in Istanbul. And all of them, sometimes subtly, sometimes proudly, carry a worldview that is not American. In this climate, a phrase like, Trump chickened out, is not just a social media gag. It is a micro-symbol in a macro struggle, over credibility, confidence, and control. As China builds alliances through infrastructure, and the US tries to rebuild them through diplomacy, another game unfolds, faster, freer, and far less predictable, the war of attention. Leaders now compete not just at summits, but on screens. Not just in press briefings, but in trending tags. In this battlefield, truth is shaped by speed. Strategy is executed in perception. And influence belongs to whoever controls the feed. For America, the question is no longer just how to lead the world, but how to speak to it. How to frame failure. How to recover narrative ground. How to respond not just to China's strategy, but to its meme. This is not about shame. It is about storytelling. And today, the world isn't asking whether the US has military or monetary might. It's asking, does it still have myth? The tariff rollback was an event. But the narrative, it's alive. Because in 2025, policy ends on paper, but power begins in what people believe happened.